I remember the first time I met Jordan like it was yesterday. It was my second year of med school, and I was drowning in anatomy textbooks. One day, I walked into class, and there he was, sitting in the front row, scribbling notes with this intense focus that made me both curious and a little jealous. "Mind if I sit here?" I asked, already pulling out the chair next to him. He glanced up, gave me a quick nod, and went back to his notes. Not exactly the warmest welcome, but I wasn't deterred. I wasn't there to make friends anyway. At least that's what I told myself. Classes flew by, and I couldn't help but notice how he always had the right answers, how the professor started calling on him more than anyone else. It bugged me. We didn't talk much at first, just exchanged the occasional nod. But I kept an eye on him. Not in a creepy way, more like sizing up the competition. One day, after another grueling lecture, I caught up with him in the hallway. "You're Jordan, right? The guy who's making the rest of us look bad." He smirked, that kind of smirk that makes you want to either punch someone or buy them a drink. "Only trying to keep up," he replied. That was the beginning. What started as a rivalry over grades quickly turned into something else. We began studying together, trading notes, challenging each other in a way that pushed us both to be better. But it wasn't just about the work. There was something about Jordan that drew me in. He was smart, yeah, but there was more to it, a kind of quiet confidence that I found myself admiring, even if I didn't want to admit it. "Let's grab a coffee," he suggested one afternoon after we'd been buried in textbooks for hours. It wasn't a question, more like an order, but I didn't mind. We walked to the nearest cafe, and for the first time we talked about more than just school. He told me about his family, how he'd transferred here from another school because it had a better program, how he didn't really know anyone yet. "Guess that makes two of us," I said, surprising even myself with how comfortable I felt around him. By the end of that coffee, I knew we'd be friends, maybe even more than that. But I wasn't ready to face that possibility yet. At least not then. The rivalry between us never disappeared, but it became more of a game, a challenge we both secretly enjoyed. And without realizing it, I started looking forward to those study sessions, those conversations that went on way too late into the night. It was like I'd found something I didn't even know I was missing, but I didn't dare think too hard about what that meant, not yet. Jordan and I fell into a routine that felt natural, almost inevitable. Our rivalry still simmered beneath the surface, but it was more playful now, an unspoken agreement to push each other harder. We spent more time together, and it wasn't long before our conversations moved beyond the walls of the library or the confines of a cafe. One night, after another late study session, Jordan asked, "Why don't you come over to my place? I've got some decent whiskey, and I'm pretty sure we've earned it." I hesitated for a moment, but then nodded.
"Sure, why not?"
His apartment was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of warmth that made you feel at ease as soon as you walked in. We sat on the couch, the whiskey burning just right as it went down, loosening us both up. "So what's your story?" he asked, breaking the silence. "You're always so focused, but you never really talk about yourself." I shrugged, staring into my glass. Not much to tell. Just trying to keep my head above water, like everyone else. He didn't push, just nodded as if he understood. And maybe he did. We started talking about everything and nothing. Our classes, our ambitions, the stuff that kept us up at night. It was easy, too easy, like we'd been having these conversations our whole lives. As the night wore on, the conversation turned more personal. Jordan started opening up about his past, about how he grew up bouncing from one foster home to another, how he'd clawed his way into med school on a scholarship. It wasn't a sob story, just facts delivered in that same calm, steady voice of his. I didn't know what to say, so I just listened. Maybe that's what he needed, someone to hear him out without judgment or pity. "You must think I'm a mess," he said after a while, his tone half joking, half serious. "Not at all," I replied, and I meant it. "You've been through a lot. Makes sense why you're so driven." He smiled at that, a real smile this time, and for a second I felt something shift between us. Something I wasn't ready to name yet. Before I knew it, We were lying back on the couch, whiskey forgotten, just talking. I don't remember what time it was when we finally dozed off, but when I woke up, the sun was creeping through the blinds, and Jordan's head was resting on my shoulder. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't even breathe, just took it all in. It felt good, right even, but it also scared the hell out of me. I wasn't sure what this meant, but I knew it was something I couldn't ignore. "Morning," Jordan mumbled as he stirred awake, lifting his head and blinking at me with those sleepy eyes. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, like waking up with him next to me wasn't a big deal. But it was. From that night on, things changed between us. We still had our usual banter, our challenges, but there was something more now, a connection that went deeper than just friendship. We didn't talk about it, didn't need to. It was just there, growing stronger with every late-night conversation, every shared moment. I started spending more time at his place, and he at mine. We'd cook dinner together, watch movies, argue about the stupidest things. And every time we crashed on the couch, I found myself waking up next to him, that same warmth spreading through me, chasing away the doubts that still lingered in the back of my mind. But I kept it all inside, refusing to put a label on what was happening between us. Maybe I was scared to mess it up, to ruin what we had. Or maybe, deep down, I knew that once I admitted what I was feeling, there'd be no going back. So I played it cool, acted like nothing had changed. But the truth was, everything had changed. And sooner or later, I was going to have to face it. One night, after another one of our late study sessions, we found ourselves back at Jordan's place, the usual routine. But this time, there was a different energy in the air. Maybe it was the way he looked at me when I laughed at one of his dry jokes, or how our legs brushed against each other as we sat on the couch, neither of us pulling away. We were watching some old movie, one of those black and white classics that Jordan loved. I wasn't paying much attention to the screen, though. My focus kept drifting back to him. How close we were sitting, how his laughter seemed to echo in my chest, how natural it felt to be here with him like this. "Hey, you okay?" Jordan asked, nudging me with his elbow. "Yeah, just thinking," I replied, trying to shake off the thoughts swirling in my head. He didn't press, just gave me that small, knowing smile of his and turned back to the movie. But I couldn't let it go. Something had been nagging at me for weeks. Something I hadn't been able to name until now. As the movie droned on, I found myself leaning into him, resting my head on his shoulder. It was a small movement, almost unconscious, but the moment it happened, everything clicked into place. I liked him. More than liked him. This wasn't just friendship anymore, and it hadn't been for a while. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, sudden, intense, and impossible to ignore. But with that realization came fear. Fear of what this meant, of what might happen if I admitted it to him, to myself. What if he didn't feel the same way? What if this messed up everything we had? My mind was racing, but my heart was telling me something else entirely. Jordan must have sensed something was off because he turned to look at me, his brow furrowed.
"Seriously? What's up with you tonight? You're way too quiet."
I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. How could I explain what was going on in my head without ruining everything? Instead, I just shook my head, forcing a smile. "It's nothing, just tired," I lied, hoping he wouldn't see through it. Jordan didn't look convinced, but he let it go.
"All right, but, you can talk to me, right? About anything."
"Yeah, I know," I said, and I meant it. That was the problem. I could talk to him about anything except this. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I tried to focus on the movie, tried to ignore the way my heart pounded every time Jordan shifted closer to me. But there was no going back now. I'd crossed some invisible line in my mind, and I couldn't pretend this was just friendship anymore. When the credits finally rolled, Jordan stretched and yawned. "Guess we should call it a night," he said. But there was a softness in his voice, like he wasn't quite ready for this to end either. "Yeah," I replied, my throat tight with everything I wasn't saying. He stood up and offered me a hand. I took it, letting him pull me to my feet, and for a moment we just stood there too close, the tension thick between us. I could feel his breath on my skin, the warmth of his hand lingering in mine. "Good night," he said softly, his eyes searching mine for something I wasn't ready to give. "Good night," I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. As I walked out the door and into the cool night air, I felt like I was leaving a part of myself behind. This wasn't just a crush, wasn't something I could brush off or ignore. I was falling for him. Hard. And there was no denying it anymore. But I wasn't ready to face what that meant. Not yet. So I shoved my hands in my pockets, took a deep breath, and started walking home, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could figure out what the hell I was going to do about it. The realization that I was falling for Jordan hung over me like a storm cloud for days. I tried to keep things normal between us, to act like nothing had changed, but every time I saw him, the weight of my feelings grew heavier. It was getting harder to ignore the pull I felt towards him, and I knew I couldn't keep it inside much longer.
One evening, after another day of trying and failing to concentrate on my studies, I found myself texting Jordan.
"Me? Hey, you free tonight?" It didn't take long for him to reply. "Jordan. Yeah, what's up?" "Me? Wanna hang out?"
Jordan. Sure. My place.
I stared at the screen for a moment, heart pounding, before typing back. "Me? Yeah, see you in a bit." When I got to his apartment, Jordan was already waiting, doctor slightly ajar like he knew I was coming. As soon as I walked in, he flashed me that easygoing smile that always seemed to make everything else fade away. "Hey," he said, closing the door behind me. "You look like you've got something on your mind." "Yeah, maybe," I mumbled, suddenly unsure of how to start. We moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots on the couch. I could feel his eyes on me, waiting for me to say something, but the words were lodged in my throat. He broke the silence first. "You've been acting weird lately. Did I do something, or—" "No, it's not that," I cut him off, shaking my head. "It's not you." "Then what is it?" He leaned forward, concern etched on his face. "You know you can talk to me, right?" The sincerity in his voice, the way he was looking at me, it was too much. I couldn't keep dodging the truth. I had to tell him, even if it scared the hell out of me. I took a deep breath. "And I've been meaning to tell you. And I don't know how you're going to react, but I can't keep it to myself anymore." He frowned, sitting up straighter. "Okay, you're kind of freaking me out here. It's just, these past few months, spending all this time together, I've realized something. The words were coming out in a rush now, almost out of my control. I've realized that what I feel for you, it's more than just friendship." Jordan's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't say anything, so I kept going. "I like you, Jordan. I mean, I really like you. More than a friend should, probably more than I should, but it's the truth." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Jordan just stared at me, his expression unreadable, and I started to panic, thinking I'd made a huge mistake. But then, slowly, he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, more like a soft, knowing one, like he'd been waiting for this moment. "I was wondering when you'd finally say it," he said, his voice gentle, almost teasing. My heart skipped a beat. "Wait, you knew?" He shrugged, still smiling. "I had a feeling. You're not as subtle as you think." I laughed, a mix of relief and nerves. "So, what does this mean? For us?" Jordan didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned closer, his hand brushing against mine. "It means that I've been waiting for you to figure it out. I've liked you for a while now, but I didn't want to push you. I wanted you to come to me when you were ready." "Jordan." I started. He cut me off, pressing a finger to my lips. "Don't overthink it," he said softly. "Let's just see where this goes, okay?" I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The tension that had been building between us for so long finally broke, replaced by something warmer, something that felt like the beginning of something real. Jordan leaned back, pulling me with him, and I found myself resting against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat calming the storm inside me. "About time you got there," he murmured, his fingers tracing patterns on my arm. "Shut up," I muttered, but I couldn't help smiling. And just like that, everything felt right. No more pretending, no more hiding from what I felt. We were on the same page finally, and it was like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. We spent the rest of the night like that, talking, laughing, just being together. And for the first time in weeks, I went to bed feeling at peace, knowing that whatever happened next, we'd face it together. Jordan and I, whatever we were going to be okay. The day after our conversation, everything felt different, but in the best way possible. When I walked into Jordan's place, it wasn't just as a friend anymore. We were something more now, though we hadn't exactly defined it. And that was okay. There was no rush, no need to slap a label on it right away. We were just us. As I sat down on the couch, Jordan joined me, close enough that our shoulders touched. The contact sent a warm shiver down my spine, and I couldn't help but smile. "You're awfully quiet," Jordan remarked, nudging me gently. "Second thoughts?" I shook my head, laughing softly. "No second thoughts. Just getting used to this, I guess." He nodded, his expression softening. "Same here, but it's a good kind of different, right?" "Yeah," I agreed, leaning into him slightly. "A good kind." For the next few weeks, our dynamic shifted in subtle ways. We still had our usual banter, still challenged each other academically, but there was an underlying connection now. A closeness that hadn't been there before. We spent more time together, not just studying, but really being together, cooking dinner, watching movies, even just sitting in comfortable silence as we worked on our own projects. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of classes, Jordan suggested we take a break. "How about we grab dinner? I'm starving, and I'm pretty sure there's no food left in my fridge." "Sounds good to me," I replied, grabbing my jacket. "Where to?" "There's this little Italian place I've been meaning to try. Heard it's good." We ended up at a cozy, dimly lit restaurant, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles on every table. The atmosphere was intimate, almost romantic, but it didn't feel awkward. If anything, it felt right. As we waited for our food, Jordan reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I've been thinking," he said, his tone serious but his eyes warm. "About us." "Yeah." I squeezed his hand lightly, curious about where this was going. "I don't want to rush things," he continued, "but I also don't want to pretend like this isn't real. What we have, I nodded, understanding what he was getting at. "I feel the same way. Whatever this is, it's real to me too." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "So we're on the same page?" "Looks like it," I said, smiling back. That night, as we walked back to his place, the cool night air wrapping around us, Jordan suddenly stopped, pulling me close. There was something in his eyes, something that made my breath catch. "I really like you," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. "More than I've liked anyone in a long time." The honesty in his words hit me hard, but in the best way. "I like you too, Jordan. A lot." And then, without another word, he leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't our first kiss, but something about it felt different, more intense, more real. Like everything we'd been holding back was finally being let out. When we pulled apart, there was no awkwardness, no uncertainty. Just a shared understanding that this was the beginning of something good, something worth holding on to. From that night on, we were officially a couple. We didn't make a big deal out of it. No social media posts, no grand announcements. We just kept being us, but now with the added layer of knowing we were in this together. Our honeymoon phase, as people like to call it, was a long one. We were practically inseparable, spending almost every free moment together. It was easy, natural, and most of all, it made me happy. Happier than I'd been in a long time. But as perfect as it seemed, I knew deep down that real relationships weren't just about the good times. Eventually, we'd face challenges, conflicts, maybe even doubts. But for now, I was content to live in the moment, to enjoy every second of this new chapter in our lives. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of what might come next. Because whatever it was, we'd face it together. Things with Jordan were going better than I ever could have imagined. We were in sync, enjoying each other's company, and it felt like nothing could bring us down. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. The end of our med school years came faster than I thought it would, and with it, the stress of securing internships. We both applied to some of the best hospitals in the country, knowing that this would be the next big step in our careers. We were hopeful, excited even, but there was a part of me that worried about what would happen if we ended up in different places. "Have you heard back from any hospitals yet?" Jordan asked one morning as we sipped coffee in his kitchen, our usual routine before heading to class. "Not yet," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You?" He nodded, but his expression was hard to read. "Yeah, actually. I got an offer from Children's in Chicago." Chicago. That was hours away from where I'd applied. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, but I forced a smile. "That's great, Jordan. I know how much you wanted that." "Yeah," he said, but there was something in his voice that told me he wasn't entirely thrilled. "And what about you?" he asked, shifting the conversation back to me. "I'm still waiting," I admitted. "But I've got a good feeling about the hospital here." Jordan nodded, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for something. "We'll make it work, no matter where we end up." I wanted to believe him, I really did. But the uncertainty was there, lurking beneath the surface, and it was hard to shake. A week later, I got my own acceptance letter, an offer from the hospital I'd been hoping for. But the excitement was dampened by the reality of our situation. We were about to face a long-distance relationship, and neither of us knew how that would play out. The night before Jordan was set to leave for Chicago, we sat together on his couch, the same place where so much between us had changed. But this time, the atmosphere was heavy, loaded with unspoken fears and doubts. "This isn't the end," Jordan said, his voice firm, like he was trying to convince both of us. "It's just a new challenge. We've handled everything else, right?" "Right," I agreed, though the words felt hollow. "We'll make it work." We spent that night wrapped up in each other, trying to make the most of the time we had left. But no matter how much we reassured ourselves, the looming distance felt like a wall slowly rising between us. When the morning came, I drove him to the airport. The ride was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that felt more like waiting for something to break. At the terminal, we stood facing each other, neither of us sure what to say. "Call me when you land," I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Of course," Jordan replied, pulling me into a tight hug. "This isn't goodbye." But it felt like it. As I watched him walk away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental between us was shifting, and I didn't know if we'd ever get it back. The first few weeks of long distance were tough, but we managed. We called, texted, video chatted whenever we could. It was enough at first, but as our internships picked up, the calls became less frequent, the texts shorter, more rushed. We were both exhausted, working long hours, and the strain started to show. Arguments crept in, usually about small things that escalated quickly. Missed calls, forgotten promises, the frustration of not being able to be there for each other in the way we used to. "I hate this," I confessed one night during a particularly tense phone call. "I hate that we're so far apart." "Me too," Jordan replied, his voice tired. "But we knew this would be hard, right? We just have to push through." "I know," I said, but the words felt heavier than they should have. I miss you." "I miss you too," he said, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "But we're going to get through this. We have to." The cracks in our relationship were starting to show, and neither of us knew how to fix them. The distance wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional, and it was growing every day. Then, one night after another long day, I got a call from Jordan. His voice was calm, too calm, and my heart sank before he even said the words. I don't know if we can keep doing this, he said, his tone heavy with resignation. I don't want to lose you, but I feel like we're drifting apart. The words hit me like a punch in the gut. I wanted to argue, to fight for us. But the truth was I felt it too. The distance was taking its toll, and no amount of calls or texts could bridge the gap that had formed between us. Maybe. I hesitated, choking on the words. Maybe we need to take a break, figure out if this is what we really want. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Jordan finally spoke. Maybe you're right. We ended the call not with a fight, not with anger, but with a quiet, mutual understanding that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the challenges life throws at you. As I hung up, I felt the weight of what we'd just done settle over me. It wasn't a breakup, not officially, but it felt like one. And as I lay there in the dark, the silence in my apartment felt colder, emptier than it ever had before. We said we'd stay friends, that we'd keep in touch, but deep down, I knew things would never be the same. And that realization was the hardest part of all. Months passed after that fateful call. Jordan and I kept in touch, but the messages were sparse, the calls even less frequent. It wasn't anger or bitterness that kept us apart, just life pulling us in different directions. I threw myself into my work, trying to fill the void that our break had left behind. But no matter how many hours I logged at the hospital, how many new people I met, there was always that empty space in my life where Jordan used to be. I wasn't sure how to move on, or if I even wanted to. Part of me hoped that time and distance would make things clearer, that I'd wake up one day and know what to do next. But that day never came. Then one afternoon, out of the blue, I got a text from Jordan. Just seeing his name on my phone screen sent a jolt through me, a mix of excitement and anxiety. Jordan, hey, I'm back in town for a few days. Want to grab a coffee? My heart raced as I stared at the message. It had been months since we last saw each other, and I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I couldn't pass up the chance to see him again. Me. Yeah, I'd like that. Where and when? We agreed to meet at the same cafe where we'd spent countless hours studying together back in med school. The familiarity of the place hit me as soon as I walked in. The smell of coffee, the sound of soft chatter, the worn wooden tables where we used to sit and debate everything from anatomy to movie plots.
Jordan was already there when I arrived, sitting at our usual table. He looked up as I approached, and for a moment it felt like no time had passed at all. He was the same Jordan, calm, composed, but with that spark in his eyes that had always drawn me in.
Hey, he said, standing up to greet me with a hug that felt both familiar and strange after all this time. Hey, I replied, pulling back just enough to look at him, really look at him. You look good. So do you, he said, his smile warm but tinged with something else, maybe nostalgia, maybe something deeper. We sat down, and the conversation started off easy enough, catching up on what we'd been up to, how our internships were going. But there was an undercurrent of tension, the unspoken questions hanging between us, too heavy to ignore for long. After a while, Jordan set down his coffee cup, his expression more serious. I've missed this, he admitted, his voice quiet. Missed us.
My heart skipped a beat. I had missed him too, more than I'd let myself admit. But I wasn't sure what he was getting at, wasn't sure if he was talking about friendship or something more.
I've missed you too, I said, choosing my words carefully. It hasn't been the same without you. He nodded, as if he'd expected that. I've been thinking a lot about what happened between us, about why we drifted apart. And I realized I don't want to let that happen again. I don't want to lose you. The honesty in his voice hit me hard. This was the Jordan I'd fallen for. The one who always said what he meant, who never played games. But it also scared me because I wasn't sure I was ready to face all the feelings I'd been burying for months. I don't want to lose you either, I confessed, my voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know how we can go back to the way things were. Maybe we don't have to go back, he suggested, his eyes meeting mine with that same intensity that had always made it impossible to lie to him. Maybe we can start fresh, a second chance, if you're willing. I wasn't sure what to say. A second chance meant risking everything again, opening myself up to the possibility of getting hurt. But as I looked at Jordan, I realized that not taking that chance might hurt even more. What about the distance? I asked, the practical side of me trying to take over. You're still in Chicago, and I'm here. Actually. He hesitated, and for the first time I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. I've been offered a position here at the Children's Hospital. It's not a done deal yet, but I'm seriously considering it. That news hit me like a ton of bricks. You're moving back? If you want me to, he said, and I could hear the vulnerability in his voice, a side of Jordan he rarely showed. I've been thinking a lot about what matters most to me, and it's you. I'm tired of being apart. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. This was everything I'd wanted to hear, but it also terrified me. What if we messed it up again? What if we messed it up again? What if the second time around was even harder than the first? But then Jordan reached across the table, taking my hand in his. We don't have to decide everything right now, he said, his voice steady. But I want to try again if you're willing. I'm willing to fight for us this time. I looked at him, at the man who'd become my best friend, my partner, and maybe, if I was brave enough to take the leap, something more again. Okay, I said finally, squeezing his hand. Let's try again. The relief in his eyes was immediate, and for the first time in months, I felt a sense of hope, like maybe, just maybe, we could make this work after all. As we left the cafe that day, walking side by side, the future felt uncertain, but full of possibilities. We didn't have all the answers, but we were willing to figure them out together. And that was enough. For now, that was more than enough. After Jordan moved back to town, things between us picked up right where they left off, only this time we were more aware of what was at stake. We had already been through the ups and downs, the distance, and the doubts. And now that we were back together, it felt like we weren't just rebuilding. We were building something new, something stronger. We didn't rush into anything, but the time apart had taught us both that when you find something real, you don't let it slip away. So when Jordan suggested we move in together, it felt like the most natural next step. One evening, as we unpacked boxes in our new apartment, Jordan suddenly paused, glancing over at me with a thoughtful expression. You ever think about what's next for us? He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes serious. I looked up from where I was arranging books on the shelf, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I mean, we've been through a lot already, he said, setting down the box he was holding and walking over to me. And now that we're back together, I don't want to waste any more time. I've been thinking about us, our future. There was something in his voice that made my heart skip a beat. I set down the book in my hand and turned to face him fully.
What are you saying?
He hesitated for just a moment, then took a deep breath. I'm saying, maybe it's time we made this official. You and me for real. How do you feel about getting married? The question hung in the air between us, and for a split second, I was too stunned to respond. But then the realization of what he was asking hit me, and a slow smile spread across my face.
Are you serious? I asked, half laughing, half disbelieving.
Completely serious, he replied, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. I know we're not exactly the most traditional couple, but I don't need a big proposal or a fancy ring to know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I felt a surge of warmth, a sense of rightness that I couldn't ignore. I want that too, I said, my voice steady. But are you sure? I mean, this is a big step.
I'm sure, Jordan said, his gaze locking with mine. We've been through enough to know what we want. And I want you, always.
The simplicity of his words, the sincerity in his eyes. It was everything I needed to hear. Okay, I said, smiling as I reached out to take his hand. Let's do it. A few weeks later, we found ourselves standing in the middle of my parents' farm, surrounded by a small group of our closest friends and family. It wasn't a big wedding, just a simple ceremony under the open sky, exactly the way we wanted it. My parents had offered to throw us a big, extravagant event, but we both agreed that something low-key felt more like us. As we stood there, exchanging vows that we'd written ourselves, I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at how far we'd come. There were no grand declarations, no over-the-top gestures, just honest words spoken from the heart. Jordan looked at me with that same intensity he always had, and I knew without a doubt that this was exactly where I was meant to be. When it was time to exchange rings, Jordan slipped a simple silver band onto my finger, and I did the same for him. The moment felt both monumental and beautifully ordinary, like we were sealing a promise that had already been made long ago. "You may kiss," the officiant said, and Jordan didn't hesitate, pulling me close and kissing me with a tenderness that made my heart swell. As our friends and family cheered, I found myself laughing, overwhelmed by the joy of the moment. Jordan and I had faced so many challenges to get here, but in that instant, none of it mattered. All that mattered was that we were here, together, ready to face whatever the future held. After the ceremony, we celebrated with a small reception in the barn, complete with homemade food, music, and dancing, under strings of lights. It was perfect, ample, intimate, and full of love. As we danced together, swaying to a slow, familiar tune, I rested my head on Jordan's shoulder, feeling completely at peace. "You happy?" Jordan asked, his voice low in my ear. "More than I ever thought I could be," I replied, tightening my hold on him. "Thank you for this, for everything." He pulled back just enough to look at me, his expression soft. "No, thank you. For sticking with me, for giving us a second chance." As the night wore on, and the guests slowly started to leave, Jordan and I slipped away, walking hand in hand down to the small pond at the edge of the property. The moonlight reflected off the water, casting a soft glow around us. We stood there in comfortable silence for a while, just soaking in the moment. Finally, Jordan spoke, his voice full of emotion. "This is just the beginning, you know. We've got so much ahead of us." "I know," I said, leaning into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against mine. "And I'm ready for whatever comes next, as long as it's with you." He kissed the top of my head, his arm wrapped securely around me. "Always." As we stood there holding each other under the night sky, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I wasn't worried about the future. We'd been through so much, but we'd come out stronger on the other side. And now, as we embarked on this new chapter together, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together, hand in hand.
This was our story, one of love, resilience, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing you found your person. And as we walked back to the farmhouse, ready to start our lives as a married couple, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of contentment, knowing that the best was yet to come.
Married life with Jordan was everything I'd hoped it would be, and then some. We settled into a comfortable rhythm, our lives blending together seamlessly. Waking up next to him every morning felt like the most natural thing in the world, and even the small, mundane moments, making breakfast together, sharing quiet evenings on the couch, held a new kind of magic. But as much as we loved each other, the reality of balancing our demanding careers with our relationship soon set in. We were both doctors, and the hospital hours were grueling, often leaving us exhausted at the end of the day. At first, we managed to make it work, finding little ways to stay connected despite our hectic schedules. We'd leave notes for each other on the fridge, send quick texts during breaks, or steal moments of affection whenever we could. Yet, as the months went on, the cracks began to show. Jordan's job at the Children's Hospital was rewarding, but it also took a lot out of him. He started picking up extra shifts driven by his passion for helping those kids, but I could see the toll it was taking on him. He came home late, drained and distracted, and it wasn't long before our time together began to dwindle. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, I came home to find Jordan already there, slumped on the couch with his head in his hands. The sight of him like that, so tired, so worn out, so worn out, so worn out, sent a pang of worry through me. "Hey," I said softly, dropping my bag and walking over to him. "Rough day?" He looked up at me, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. "Yeah, you could say that." I sat down next to him, placing a hand on his knee. "You've been working a lot lately. Maybe too much." "I know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "But there's just so much to do, so many kids that need help. I feel like I can't say no." I understood where he was coming from, but it didn't make it any easier to watch him push himself to the brink. "You're doing amazing work, Jordan, but you can't pour from an empty cup. You need to take care of yourself, too." He sighed, leaning back against the couch. "You're right. It's just hard to step back, you know." "I do," I said, squeezing his knee. "But I'm here and I want to help. We're in this together, remember?" He gave me a tired smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I know. I just don't want to let anyone down." "You're not," I assured him. "But I need you too, Jordan. We need each other." He nodded, and for a moment, it felt like we were on the same page again. But as the days turned into weeks, the strain only grew. We started arguing more. Little spats that flared up over the smallest things. Dishes left in the sink, missed calls, forgotten plans. It wasn't the arguments themselves that worried me, but the way they seemed to chip away at the easy connection we'd always had. One night, after a particularly tense exchange, I found myself lying awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while Jordan slept beside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping away, that the distance we'd fought so hard to overcome was creeping back in, this time from within our own home. The next morning, over a quiet breakfast, I decided we needed to talk. Really talk.
"Jordan," I began, setting down my coffee cup. "We need to figure this out. I don't want us to keep going like this, like we're just two people living in the same house, but not really connecting."
He looked up from his plate, his expression serious. "I know. I've been feeling it too." "Then let's do something about it," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "We can't let this become our new normal." He nodded, and for the first time in a while, there was a spark of determination in his eyes. "You're right. We need to prioritize this." We agreed to make some changes, to set aside time for just the two of us, no matter how busy our schedules got. We started with small things, taking walks after dinner, having at least one day a week where we didn't talk about work, just enjoyed each other's company. It wasn't easy, and it didn't fix everything overnight, but it was a start. But even with these efforts, I could see that Jordan was still struggling. He continued to take on more at the children's hospital, and though he tried to balance it with our relationship, the weight of it all was starting to show. He became more withdrawn, more distant, and I couldn't help but feel that I was losing him, bit by bit. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, I noticed him checking his phone again, his expression tense. He'd been getting a lot of calls lately, and though I tried not to pry, it was hard not to wonder what was going on. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, just some work stuff." But the way he said it, the way he avoided looking me in the eye, set off alarm bells in my head. I wanted to push, to ask more, but I held back, afraid of what I might hear. As the weeks went on, the distance between us grew, and despite our best efforts, the tension continued to build. We were still in love, still committed to each other, but the strain was undeniable. One night, after another exhausting day, Jordan sat me down, a troubled look on his face. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice strained. Maybe I need to take a step back from the hospital, at least for a while." The admission shocked me, especially coming from someone as dedicated as Jordan. "What do you mean?" I think I've been trying to do too much," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I've been so focused on work that I've been neglecting us, and that's not what I want. I don't want to lose you." His words hit me hard, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. "Jordan, I don't want to lose you either, but we need to find a balance. something that works for both of us. He nodded, his eyes filled with the same determination I'd seen in him when we first started dating. I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I just need you to know that I'm in this for the long haul, no matter what. And with that, we began the slow, steady process of rebuilding, of finding our way back to each other. It wasn't easy, and there were still tough days ahead, but we were both committed to making it work. Because that's what marriage was, facing the struggles together, working through the hard times, and never giving up on the love that brought us together in the first place. As we lay in bed that night, Jordan's arm wrapped around me. I felt a renewed sense of hope. We weren't perfect, and we didn't have all the answers, but we had each other. And as long as we held on to that, I knew we'd be okay. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we'd face them together, just like we always had. Months passed, and slowly, Jordan and I found our footing again. It wasn't a quick fix. Nothing ever is when it comes to relationships. But we were learning, adjusting, and most importantly, talking. We made a point to communicate, to check in with each other, to make sure we were still on the same page. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was what mattered. But as things started to stabilize, something else began to creep into our lives. An idea, a possibility that neither of us had fully considered until now. It started with small comments, offhand remarks during quiet moments. Jordan said one night as we sat on the couch, his head resting on my shoulder, "I've been thinking a lot about the future."
Yeah, I replied, running my fingers through his hair absent-mindedly. What about it?
He shifted slightly so he could look up at me, his eyes serious but warm. About what comes next. We've got this great life together, but I've been wondering if maybe we're ready for something more. I felt my heart skip a beat, the implication of his words sinking in. What do you mean something more? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I've been thinking about starting a family. Not right away, but eventually. What do you think?
The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. We'd never talked about kids before, not seriously. And the thought of it was both thrilling and terrifying. But as I looked at Jordan, at the man who had been my partner through so much, I realized that the idea didn't scare me as much as it might have in the past.
Honestly, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. I think it's something we should seriously consider. I mean, we've made it through everything else together, right? Jordan's expression softened, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yeah, we have. And I think we'd be pretty good at it. Raising a kid, yeah, I agreed, the idea settling comfortably in my mind. I think we would. From that night on, the idea of starting a family became a more frequent topic of conversation. We didn't rush into anything. There was still a lot to consider, a lot to plan. But it was there, a quiet, hopeful thought that lingered in the back of our minds. We spent the next year focused on strengthening our relationship, on making sure we were ready for whatever came next. Jordan cut back on his hours at the hospital, and we made a point to spend more time together, to enjoy the life we'd built. We traveled, we laughed, we fought, and we made up. And through it all, the idea of a family was always there, a constant reminder of what we wanted our future to be. One day, after a long hike through the woods, a tradition we'd started as a way to reconnect and clear our heads, we found ourselves sitting by a quiet stream, the sun setting in the distance. Jordan reached over, taking my hand in his expression thoughtful. He began, his voice soft, I think we're ready. I looked at him, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. Yeah, I think we are. We sat there for a while, just holding hands, letting the moment sink in. It was a big decision, a life-changing one, but it didn't feel scary anymore. It felt right. A few months later, after a lot of discussion, planning, and a few nervous laughs, we started the process of growing our family. It wasn't easy, nothing ever is, but we faced it together with the same determination and love that had carried us through every challenge so far. As the months passed and we moved closer to making our dream a reality, I couldn't help but reflect on how far we'd come. From the awkward beginnings of our friendship to the rocky challenges of long distance, through the highs and lows of marriage, we'd been through it all. And now we were about to embark on a new adventure, one that would change our lives forever. The day finally came when we held our child in our arms for the first time. A tiny, perfect reminder of everything we'd been through together. As I looked at Jordan holding our child with tears in his eyes, I knew that every struggle, every challenge, had led us to this moment. "This is it," Jordan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "This is what we were meant to do." I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak, and wrapped my arms around him, our family now complete. In that moment, I realized that life would never be the same again. And that was exactly how it should be. We had faced the unknown before, and we would do it again, together, as a family. This was our new beginning, and as we stepped into this next chapter, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it with the same love, strength, and resilience that had carried us through everything else. Because that's what we did. That's who we were. And as long as we had each other, there was nothing we couldn't handle.